on? It's good to see you, how you been? I can't believe we ain't linked up for so long. I've been so busy with work, I ain't even seen the team.
Consequences was a ready-made story that was written by Harry Shota and Rob Morgan from Playlines, and they had done a brilliant job at making a really great branching narrative using a linear audio path. And we met Bose out at the Future Storytelling Festival in October 2018. When we met up with them, they were already starting to release their Bose frames out in the US, and they were developing their spatial audio and integrating the Bose AR SDK developer program, and asked us to be on board, which was brilliant because then we're able to kind of experiment with the Bose and the AR and the frames with a story like Consequences and develop a spatial audio experience that will give fans a really cool 360 experience in the middle of the story. Our ultimate goal is to create the full-length show in full spatial audio, so look out for that.
I know you say I'm always drinking, but I work hard. You see the prices they charging in these bloody bars, rip off, and I ain't gonna kick off inside the place. Just wanna find a room that's playing.
Bristol, and this plinth has its own story to tell. Edward Colston became rich through his involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. In 1895, 70 years after his death, a bronze statue of him was placed in the middle of Colston Avenue in the center of the city. There have been disagreements about the way Bristol's public spaces represent Colston, and many feel that his actions strongly conflict with their values. On the 7th of June, 2020, his statue was pulled down by members of the public. This event made headlines across the world and has fired up the debate around what statues are for and who or what we want to remember in our public spaces.
I'm Stevie and I'm 5 years old. When they took the bear down, it made me sad. The bear's black and white, like everyone.
So the inspiration for the piece came from an existing piece I had, which I did for a podcast series for the Pervasive Media Studio. I was looking at developing textures, so kind of take the same sort of concept, but look at adding textures of like African prints and different colours and just sort of seeing how that transferred. I think it's incredibly important people, feel represented within the environments they live in. And I think within public space, that is something which you hardly ever see.
After the statue got torn down, it was a moment in my life where I was literally looking from the outside in, deciding to move to Bristol. When that happened, I remember being in Shropshire in a park, and my wife was looking on the news, and she'd been, the one that didn't necessarily want to move that much. And then when she saw that happen, she was like, oh yeah, now it makes sense. Whether you like it or not, what happened, stuff's happening here. And I'm the kind of person, I want to run towards a tornado and film it.
And I think being in lockdown made me realise how isolated people can be if you haven't got that support. Like the circle idea is that full circle of different ages, different parts of your life, but how those people can really influence you throughout your life, from child to adult. Because I think everything that happens as a child is so important to shaping you as an adult. Yeah, I think most statues that in the city are basically of rich white men. It would be nice to see something different.
Future Places Toolkit is an augmented reality engagement activity for neighbourhood visioning, planning consultation and participatory architectural design. Rather than hosting a meeting in a local community centre, our activity happens outside, in the very place that's being redeveloped.
What's your preferred future? What would you like to see here on Harold Road?
What we want to do is bring together a really wide range of local people, younger and older, and inspire them to imagine preferred futures for where they live. Using immersive technologies and sci-fi storytelling, we take you on a journey into the future of your place.
Who's going to kick us off? Who has an idea?
We carefully guide you through a conversation that gets you sharing what your hopes and dreams are for your neighbourhood.
It's going to have kind of an adventure playground here.
As you can see, an artist listens in remotely and draws what you describe in real time, which appears live right before your eyes. We've tried to make a way of doing consultation that's fun and engaging to be a part of.
Maybe it should be a plane, you drawing on the plane.
You get to look around the future you create, to walk about and explore it in 3D, and to hear what it might sound like. The aim is to spark people's imaginations, encourage them to do some dreaming together and think speculatively about their place. You get to talk about what you think your area needs, like more shops and amenities, and then to watch them appear. We can also drop in existing models, like these trees, and you can see architects' plans in their context, discuss and adapt them. We save the visualizations all the groups come up with, so these can be shared with architects, planners or developers, and other members of the community can come along and take a look through the different drawings in the location, see them layered over their street.
Hello and thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the show reels. We felt it was worth showing them at length. These are 4 amazing projects that we're going to be discussing in this session. I'm Angela Chan. I'm Head of Inclusion and a doctoral researcher in inclusive innovation with Story Futures Cluster at Royal Holloway. And for the next 45 minutes, we're going to be talking about augmented reality as a tool for creative placemaking and social practice. We're going to explore the role that it can play as a participatory medium and a platform for underrepresented voices. And I'm going to be exploring with our esteemed panel of innovators the challenges and the value of making that kind of work. And we hope to get you involved in a lively debate on the future of AR via Hop-In. Please ask your questions in the Titanic main stage, not anywhere else, we won't see them. On the panel today, we have 4 immersive creators whose work represents really exciting new directions for AR. all of them testing the boundaries of what the tech can do for us and bringing new perspectives to creative placemaking, opening up a much-needed debate about the democratic potential of immersive. On my right, I have Rob Morgan, founder and creative director of Playlines AR, who, with King's College London, created Street of Eyes, which you saw there, a very sexy trailer, and a gamification of the debate around personal freedom of public space. Nosa, filmmaker, currently in production on an AR feature, possibly the first AR feature, with BFI and Story Futures Academy funding, I have to say that, entitled The Young and the Dopeness. I've been practicing, I'm like not even cool enough to pull off the title. Sorry, you can do it better than me. And Chaz Golding, creative director and co-founder of the Cargo Movement. His project, The People's Platform, you saw there, invited the public to create digital alternatives in the midst of that debate following the toppling of Colston's statue. And last but not least, Paul Clarke, senior lecturer in performance studies at Bristol and a digital placemaking fellow with the Bristol and Bath cluster. And his Future Places toolkit acts as a platform for communities to envision the future of their built environment. So I just want to start by asking each of you to tell us a little bit about your project. We saw quite a lot there, other than Nosa's, which isn't made yet, so you've got more work to do there. But I would like to understand why AR, what were the affordances of AR that allowed you to tell your story or engage people in place in the way it did? Rob, I'm going to go with you first.
Hello, I'm Rob. I'm the creative director of Playlines. You saw two projects by us. One was Street of Eyes, the CCTV project, and one was Consequences, which is a augmented reality drama set which turns any location into a augmented reality grime nightclub. Two very different kind of approaches to AR, but that's because for me, AR, the fundamental interest of it has always been about recontextualizing the way that the user is using the space that they are in. So in the case of Street of Eyes, which we made last year, and then, we made most of it this year, it's a stealth game that's played on the real streets using the locations of real CCTV cameras, like a classic Metal Gear Solid style stealth game, except that you are standing in the real world, and we're using the locations of real CCTV cameras to create hazards, which you then need to navigate as you move around the space so that you're not spotted. It's intended to make a point about facial recognition, although we also integrated within it a historical walking tour of a specific area of London outside of King's College, which is also, it's a walking tour about the history of surveillance and police surveillance in the capital. So it's intended to be kind of an educational piece that's integrated with a piece of gameplay that changes the context of how you walk down the street, because it turns into gameplay this almost invisible aspect of urban infrastructure, the CCTV cameras proliferating all around us. And instead, by making them into gameplay hazards, we're trying to affect the way that users walk down the street so that even after they finish playing the game, they might they might walk down the street differently and look for cameras even when they've stopped playing the game and they're left that behind, by changing the context of public space for them. By contrast, Consequences was a drama that we made in collaboration with a rapper called Harry Schotter, who I wasn't cool enough to know about before we started working together, but who I assure you is extremely cool. And it's a choose-your-own-adventure rap opera, which we turned into an augmented reality layer. In terms of placemaking, it's actually very modular, and we run it in lots of different locations. So effectively what it does is turn any location into an augmented reality story-driven nightclub that you can dwell in and spend time in. We've run it inside nightclubs, that's where the video games come from. But we've also run it in historical buildings and inside office buildings. And it's always about changing the context of where the user's standing so that they're in more of a story-rich environment, even though we're using the layout of the real place. We're piggybacking on that to create a narrative.
Thank you, Rob. Nosa, I'm going to come to you next. I mean, Street of Eyes is quite a sort of political, atmospheric experience of AR in place. Nosa, yours is much more subjective, isn't it? Tell us a bit about the feature that you're planning.
Yeah, so The Young and the Dopeness is sort of an AR narrative feature film, and it aims to bring sort of a new form of narrative storytelling to people by setting it within a sort of streetwear culture, and it's accessed in sort of specific locations that are authentic to that culture. and sort of uses their so-called day-to-day journeys of the world to sort of access the content through the tech that they have on them and around them. And the idea for it kind of came out of the fact that, and it's not a surprise to anyone, that streetwear is like a male-dominated kind of culture, and I suppose I felt like I don't really see myself in a lot of the things, and we'd all inhabit the same spaces, so people kind of hang out in shops a lot, and so there's places that are already inhabited by these people but aren't really being used by them. And I thought, I'm a skeptic of a lot of technology, but I thought, what would make me and people in this world want to engage with that, and how would I use the space that they're already in to do that? And the idea as a filmmaker was to make a film and really sort of insert myself and my experiences and my identity in the film, and then sort of place it somewhere where the people who maybe weren't, that didn't have any link to that sort of experience couldn't ignore, because they were already hanging out in those spaces.
So we use the term AR feature as a sort of throwaway thing. What actually is that? How do you start to structure something that is a familiar narrative into AR?
Well, I kind of just started with sort of, I guess, a casual 5-act structure, and thinking about how I can link that to sort of these tangible elements and tangible spaces. And yeah, because it's not out, I can't necessarily super go into that. But yeah, it was just really thinking about how to use those tangible elements that they would pick up and utilize, and that tangible space that they were already inhabiting, to sort of think about, a story that I could relate to, but wouldn't be so alien to the culture it's for.
So the augmented reality experience in the place might allow you to, say, dwell in a part of the story for longer and soak up the atmosphere or explore in a different way.
Yeah, and I think what's quite interesting about, that culture in the first place is that money is kind of useless, because a lot of things you can't buy with tangible money. You buy through apps. So, theoretically, people are already on their phones, and so it's kind of just like yeah, how can you utilize phones and space to, tell a story where people are already at?
Okay, thank you. Chaz, I'm going to go to you next, and that is the last time I'm going to go up and down this line, because it gets too boring, it's like Zoom. But tell us about the People's Platform and how that project came about, and how it sits in the context of your wider digital business.
Yeah, well, the People's Platform, obviously, as you can see from the video, came about after the statue of Edward Colston came down. And it's really a project about giving people within the city a voice. I mean, the statue came down out of years of frustration, people not being heard, and the narratives not being explained of other individuals in the city. So I thought the People's Platform was AR was a great opportunity to give visibility to those voices. So we did a call out, and we asked people for their ideas, what they would like to see replace the statue, any opinions, any ideas, and we got hundreds and hundreds of different individuals kind of submit ideas, whether it was sketches, drawings, or written information about their perspectives on what they would like to see in their city. And it wasn't really politically motivated, really. It was more about just opening up the forum and then giving people the opportunity to see their ideas in lights, as it were. So. Yeah, the People's Platform started like that. Then we did a process of kind of selection of ideas, trying to kind of get a broad range of individuals, and it's ongoing. And we think we're going to run the engagement for a year and try and get as many of those concepts realised into three-dimensional visions of people's concepts and ideas. Yeah.
And I understand that. I mean, obviously, the site of the Colston statue is contested, but I understand even the sort of furniture around the AR experience has been controversial.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, what the beauty of AR is that it's impermanence, and we go into that within the project, and the whole idea of this kind of digital graffiti, if you like. It can come up, it can come down. We can have multiple ideas kind of realised in the same space, and I think that's really, really fascinating. But when we launched the project, we put up a sign, a QR code that was a metal sign that sits next to the plinth that gives people opportunity as they go by, because it's become a tourism tourist attraction, the empty plinth. And so when people go by, they can just kind of point their phones at it. And a big part of the project as well was reducing the barriers of engagement. So a lot of the people who were submitting ideas didn't even know what AR was really. You know, they just wanted to have their voices heard. So they gave them an opportunity to kind of see this new technology and be visualized within this new technology, even if they didn't understand the tech themselves. We worked with them to draw out their ideas, whether it was just a written idea or whether it was a sketch, to then transform that into the platform. So yeah, we worked with a series of companies, and I've got to thank Apache and Eighth Wall for donating their time and expertise to make it happen, because without the collaborations of other companies as well, it just wouldn't have been a reality.
Yeah, it's a really exciting collaborative process. But I understand it has been contested, right? People have ripped up your sign.
Yeah, exactly. The sign has been torn up on several occasions because people see this as a kind of a politically motivated act, and it's not. It's really about opening the forums. And a lot of these decision-making processes happen behind closed doors, and I think this was an opportunity to make that, open, make it a wider discussion.
Thank you. And that leads me nicely on to Paul, whose work also engages with the public in real space in that very sort of open, collaborative way. Tell us a bit about Future Places Toolkit.
I think there's a really interesting relationship between the People's Platform and also Future Places Toolkit. In a way, we're working in a very different contested environment, but planning consultations, pretty contested environment. As you saw from the video, the video you saw is of a kind of prototype, and you're actually seeing myself and Michela from Fenizi, the creative technologist, demonstrating there rather than a session with the public. And Future Places Toolkit is very much still in development. But as you can see, it's an augmented reality engagement activity for neighbourhood visioning and for participatory architectural design. In a way, it's a kind of tool for co-creating with people and co-designing both buildings and also the public realm. And I guess thinking about why AR, which was the question you kind of began with, for us, what's really useful about AR is that, planning consultation tends not to take place in the site that's being developed, tends not to take place on the street. The consultation, tends to be a bit dry, tends to be some boards that are put up in like a local community centre, and we thought, wouldn't it be much more productive, hopefully also entertaining and engaging, to get people together in the very place that's being developed and to have the discussion, to have the debate in situ. So what happens with Future Places Toolkit is people get to see the designs that they come up with collaboratively through facilitated conversation appear immediately around them, layered over today's architecture, layered over the buildings in their neighbourhood. And they can also see architects' plans overlaid onto the place. And they get to kind of adapt, comment on them in context, in their context. And in a way, there's a relationship with something Chaz was just alluding to, which I guess is that the groups make a series of collaborative drawings, and they come up with a whole range of different preferred futures, which they get to take a look at, and people can return. They can see these multiple different futures. So there's not a single design, it's not the future, instead it's kind of multiple versions of future possibilities for the place, which can all kind of coexist and be overlaid and returned to. And I guess the other thing for me that's really useful about AR is that the reality we're augmenting is still visible. So with Future Places Toolkit, you're holding up, a device that we talk about being a device that enables you to see into the future. Admittedly, it's a mobile phone on a selfie stick. But around it and through it, you can still see today's reality. So what's useful, I think, is actually not about merging realities, but instead, not about it being seamless, but instead we're really interested in the gap between what people come up with and the augmented reality drawings that we see and the reality of today. And it's in that gap that we can do some critical reflection.
I'm particularly interested, Paul, in your process, because you get people visioning with a sort of a sci-fi approach, don't you? Tell me a bit about that.
Yeah, so that's the other gap, I suppose, is that we're really interested in science fiction narratives and speculative design, and we're interested in science fictions because through science fiction, we can reflect critically on today. So that might be through a dystopian science fiction, it might be through a more positive, utopian kind of solar punk science fiction. But science fiction allows us to reflect critically on today, and also we're using a kind of dramaturgy, a narrative structure that transports people into the future in a way to shift people out of their everyday concerns, and also maybe their concerns around planning constraints, and to enable people to imagine. So we encourage people to imagine 100 years into the future, in order really to free up people's imaginings. But through that kind of speculation, we think we really get at what matters for people, for the themes, the kind of wants and needs for their place. And then we can come back and we can talk about the steps that you might take as a community, or specifically what might go into a community development brief that might lead to those preferred futures, rather than perhaps some of the dystopian ones.
Brilliant, thank you. And I'm going to ask the million-dollar question. Something's been bugging me, right? All your projects are so exciting. They're really pushing at the boundaries of what AR can do for the people. Is this the beginning of a new wave of like guerrilla place-based interventions where creative technologists and radical protest art meet, where we're able to liberate the voice of the people? But does AR really give voice to underrepresented people? Or, well, let's play Paul's sci-fi game for a minute. Imagine you live in a dystopian society where a government wanted to quell protest or amplify discord or start a culture war, for instance, in 100 years from now. And if there was a government like that, wouldn't it be the perfect protest for that government? One that doesn't touch the landscape. Just put it all in AR. You know, allow people to see what they want to see, step into their echo chamber. You know, does AR really create this kind of radical shift, or does it just allow us to see what we want to see? Rob. Big question.
Okay. So that is a really interesting one. I think one of the fundamentally interesting ideas about AR is that it's, in a sense, it unlocks the ability to put non-zero-sum information out into the world all over the place. In the sense that if you create a layer of augmented reality material, if you're tagging or creating information that you're adding to the real world, if you're labeling the real world, that is not competitive with any other labels that anyone else has digitally assigned to the real world. So if you create a layer, or if you add a comment, or if you leave someone a note in the margin of reality, which is what AR allows us to do, it doesn't push out anyone else's statement because it's all just stored in the digital layer. We're not limited by word count or by wall space in augmented reality. So you don't have to compete, for example, to decide what should be on the plaque of a statue. You don't have to have a single argument or even have a single person making that decision. Instead, you can create a digital layer which people can inscribe on, and then you can have multiple things taking place on that same plinth, on the empty plinth that the Colston statue left. I think there's something really powerful in this idea that in AR, public space could become, you know, never mind the fourth plinth, which is picked by artists, it could become kind of a fifth plinth where art could proliferate, and commentary and people's statements on the real world really could kind of multiply. Fundamentally, I think the Culture Secretary talks a lot about retain and explain, that instead of tearing statues down, we should retain them and explain them. I think creating multiple layers, multiple avenues, multiple channels for multiple explanations from different perspectives is a really, really good thing, and will allow multiple perspectives to be enshrined in public space, but also will encourage people to encounter multiple perspectives as they walk through public space, so that looking at
the environment, doesn't
exactly.
it? Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
It adds to it, and it's multiple layers of intrigue, isn't it? And how can that be bad? And that's going to add to the impact of a space, isn't it?
So we're breaking down dominant narratives. You hope that you're actually in a place where all cultural experiences have, as you put it, these endless notes in the margins of history, but how do you end up not just having like a load of digital graffiti? Where do you take your dominant narrative from? I mean, Nosa, your project, it's very much about subjective experience of a subculture. How do you start to make an impact with things like that, so that your subculture, so that people feel seen?
I think it's quite interesting because the video that we watched, I guess, before we came on screen was sort of saying, AR is there, but it doesn't sort of increase like friction, it's all that sort of stuff. But I guess with my project, I'm trying to increase the friction, I'm trying to be seen, and I'm putting it somewhere where people who I'm talking to cannot ignore. And so that's what I find quite interesting about the world. And I know with your project, you're not necessarily trying to start anything, but I think it's cool that people are even trying to rip up.
Exactly.
You're
You're antagonizing people. You're getting underneath people's skin, aren't you? So you're creating a reaction, which is quite interesting. But I still think it boils down to storytelling with everything, isn't it? How good is your story? How good is your narrative? And what was interesting is that Stevie's story, 5 years old, was one of the best stories. It was the simplicity of the narrative, wasn't it? It's just like people got it straight away. They were like, all right, it's a bear. It's like bear's black and white. We get this, It's like we can see that and we can understand that as an image, and it's also an image for Bristol, the Bristol Bear, which is a statue that got taken down in a part of Bristol which was kind of reclaimed by a subculture. Ultimately, it was a physical statue. So for her to want that brought back was quite a powerful message and told a really interesting narrative.
I'm really interested in both of your processes actually of working with people. And Chaz, I know that in a way you've worked quite really closely in quite a bespoke way with your contributors, as we would call them in telly. People worked with artists, didn't they, to realise their vision. How much did they come with versus how much you sort of layered on top of that?
It varied every time. I mean, some people had a real nugget of an idea. Some people had really thought through their concept and, really had it in their head, distilled the idea down. But it varied with everybody. But, it was really about that one-to-one experience of working with somebody and telling their story. It wasn't really about the statue that was created at the end of it. It was about giving a voice to that person's perspective within the city and how they saw their own city and how they wanted to be reflected in that city. The statue was a byproduct, and the AR is a byproduct of the deeper narrative of that individual.
And it was open access, wasn't it? Open submission.
Yeah, absolutely. No barriers whatsoever. We got submissions from all over the map. So, and it was about trying to tell a rich, diverse set of stories, really, and that's with the work we do at Cargo Movement. It's about individual narratives, and I think with it, when you dial down to an individual story, people can get hold of it a lot easier, and then kind of just feel a bit, get more empathy to that story as well. So yeah.
And so the immersive creator in that situation becomes both a sort of a facilitator, an interpreter, a liberator of underrepresented voices. Is that the thought behind it?
Absolutely. I mean, we're about giving people the opportunity to be heard, and I think AR can magnify that. It's global. Anybody can engage with these stories from any part of the world, and they have done. And it was important for us with the technology as well that it wasn't just visible in situ at the plinth. It was about you could take that experience home with you. You have your own plinth at home, and you can experience it wherever you go. So I think that's really powerful as well.
Thank
flexibility.
You. And Paul, tell us a bit about your process and how you engaged people in these visioning exercises.
Well, I guess one of the things I wanted to say was about kind of underrepresentation, and I guess we've just been talking about, in a way, kind of diversifying, using AR to kind of diversify the histories, and for those histories maybe to also be memories and to be kind of subjective, those kind of place-based stories that are told. I guess one thing I wanted to say was that in a way underrepresented people tend also to be underrepresented in futures. So if we're talking about the kinds of stories that we tell, if we think about kind of science fiction stories, for instance, science fiction stories also and visions of the future also need to be kind of decolonized. And particularly I was thinking about Adrienne Mary Brown, who talks about living inside someone else's imagination. So and the need to get into the game of imagination. So I think it's really important to think about who gets to tell stories about the future. And in the case of Future Places Toolkit, I suppose you can think about communities living in places that have been designed for them by others. In a sense, they are living inside someone else's imagination, a space that's been imagined for them. And in a way, I guess what we want to see is people being able to visualize their own futures, to see themselves or to imagine themselves in those futures, and in a way to kind of narrate themselves into futures from which they've probably been excluded. And in a way, of course, the other thing that people are excluded from, or a range of people are excluded from, is planning processes and consultation.
That brings me nicely to a couple of timely questions from Brian Waterfield and Alice Tennant. Brian asks, how can you manage expectations if you open the planning to imagination but don't consider limitations? You know, when you take your app in your process into the real world and you start engaging with actual developments happening, how do you manage that expectation for people?
Yeah, that's really important. It's one of the important conversations we've had initially actually with Everyone, and then also with Stride Treglay and the architects who we were working with. And it's really important to set out in the introduction, in a way, when we host the activity, it's really important to set out what is possible, so what stage we're at in the planning process, the kind of what will happen to people's ideas, to people's data, how that will be used. If we think of the drawings as data, we think about the kind of ownership of those. But yes, also the kind of impact that people can have. And in a way, the last thing that we want to happen is to become part of a sort of performance of consultation in which architects, developers, the council are kind of using Future Places Toolkit to art wash, if you like, or to demonstrate community buy-in to a scheme that actually the community haven't had any involvement in developing. So I think for us, the ideal time to come in is at the kind of neighbourhood visioning stage, and it's at a point when actually communities can contribute to the development brief, so that the development that's realised is development that the community wants. And then potentially the developers may find there's less dispute, there's less contestation, there's less pushback, and they might have a smoother planning process.
I'm sorry, I'm laughing because I've slightly, completely lost my way to the main stage questions in here, so I'm going to have to remember them. Alice Tennant asks, what were the barriers that people experienced using that new technology? I mean, for Chaz as well, were there barriers to overcome in your work? Chaz, perhaps first. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's the barriers of their understanding of the process, really. They weren't sure what they were getting when I kind of engaged with them and said, yeah, we wanted to realise your concept or idea. They were like, well, where's this going, and how is this going to work? I mean, I think that the barrier was their imagination, really, in terms of they didn't know what the final output would be. But I think that was really interesting as well, because they would approach it in a completely different way than practically you would approach it. Say an architect would approach it, or it's a kind of a 3D designer would approach it, because they're coming with something that doesn't have the same parameters. So your imagination is being really enriched by that process, because they're coming with suggestions that you would never even think of, you know. So I think that's really good. You're both gaining something from that process, and then also opening up some of their, you know, personal narrative as well, which is really, you know, real privilege.
I mean, there's an interesting question from Joanna Lee. There's quite a lot of interest in this kind of grassroots-led AR movement. Joanna asks, how do you put the call out to potential contributors, and how do you access underrepresented people in your projects? How do you make sure those voices are included?
Yeah, I mean, it was just a general call out. I mean, we luckily, because of the, you know, the waves that the statue caused, you know, there was a lot of focus on Bristol and a lot of press, and you know, we got a lot of, you know, different press outlets pushing out the story. So, you know, it was quite a wide range of people that were engaged with, because it was different types of media. I mean, we didn't search out certain underrepresented groups of individuals. We just kind of did it as a broad call out, because we didn't want it to be, right, we're targeting certain voices. We wanted it to be fully inclusive, because I think that was a real part of the mission. And I think that was with the statue, with the sign that we created being defaced and, you know, vandalized. I think there was perception from certain parts of the city that we were trying to create a one-sided narrative, and I think it was really important that that wasn't done. You know, as everybody was part of this process, and I think that's...
And that happened quite organically.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we didn't target any group specifically. Yeah.
I'm going to stick with these questions, because they're much more interesting than mine. Nosa Anonymous asks, how can these technologies become grassroots-led? You know, how can they give access to creatives on the ground? The question says this could be transformative for creative, sustainable livelihoods for people who already live in a place. You know, when you're thinking about the work that you're making in AR, how much do you think about that audience and what it does for them, or what it inspires them to do?
I guess first and foremost, I kind of think about why I'm using the technology and if it should be used, and then what it's about. I think, like, yeah, I don't know. I think, like, talking... What was the question about, like, audiences?
Well, is it about making people feel seen? Using the technology, you talked about them using the technology that's accessible to them, but is that experience, that very visceral experience about, you know, really feeling like you're dwelling with others in your place who are similar to you? I mean, I think a lot of the time in the media, I know in the work that I've done at Channel 4 and the BBC, young audiences just don't feel seen. Is this an opportunity?
Yeah, I think for me anyway, this sort of world and this technology kind of feels like opera a lot of the time, and it just feels a bit like inaccessible. And so I always sort of, my North Star is, would I do it? Would my friends do it? How could my friends do it? Would it be easy for them to, you know, just pick up their phone and use some open source software to, like, make something AR? And if so, then I class that as accessible, and then I will use it to make what I make. I won't, you know, go for the highest technology, because then it just is like, why?
Because you've done projects on Instagram that are narrative as well, and place-based, haven't you?
Yeah.
This is such the core issue, this idea of, can people access it through open access, through open source? Like, I think this is something critical we need to be talking about in AR right now, because we're talking about the ability to add stuff to public space. Advertising is obviously going to be a really, really big part of how that works. And our public spaces have already kind of been bought and paid for by advertisers, and it's not, you know, adding your own notes to public space is usually considered graffiti. It's very easy to imagine a space where AR gets closed down and the digital dimension of public space also gets bought up. The ability to tag stuff to reality also gets bought up, or at least strongly limited by, you know, big platform corporations. And I think we need to be talking about this now, because otherwise the extent to which people are already underrepresented in our society is also going to result in those people being underrepresented even in the digital layer, which is replicating an unfairness of reality that doesn't need to exist in the digital layer. I mean, it doesn't need to exist in reality either. That sounds wrong. But, you know, there's nothing stopping everybody from being able to write on the digital layer, except for commercial interests.
Is there nothing stopping them? I've got a brilliant question here. How is AR, or AR as a form of protest, accessible? You need to know it's there, you need to know how to access it and have the access to it. And obviously access is restricted by digital poverty. Doesn't it just perpetuate the dominant narrative?
It's a fair point, and obviously things that happen in the digital layer are no substitute for things that happen in reality, particularly tearing down statues. Like, you can't substitute for that.
Yeah, but a big part of what we were doing was making sure that those barriers of inclusion weren't there. So it was browser-based. It was like straight away you could just point your phone and you could engage, and anybody with a smartphone was able to experience the application. So I mean, that was a big part of it for us, you know, to making sure that you could get straight into it. You know.
And if you don't have a smartphone?
You don't have a smartphone.
Or data?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is there. I mean, a big part of the delivery was also the linear narrative for the individual. So there was a big filmmaking aspect to it. So you could, even if you weren't kind of savvy or you didn't really understand the technology, you still were able to engage with the story. And I think that was important for us as well in traditional filmmaking.
Yeah. And I think it's really important to think about equitable access and to think about the digital divide. And you know, one of the things we did to address that is, well, we provide the kit, so we're providing the devices for the experience. And in fact, the way you interact, the way you explore the future that you collaboratively draw together is simply by holding up your device, moving it around, and you can simply explore spatially. You don't need to engage with the screen at all. So it doesn't really require digital literacy. And that's really important to us, because one of the things we really want to do is, whilst we're using AR, and of course that might immediately make you think, oh, this is going to engage younger audiences, actually we really want to engage older audiences also, and we found that that's been the case. So yeah, we've been working in Knoll West, partly with the support of Knoll West Media Centre, but also actually partly on the kind of request of Philwood Broadway Working Group, who are in fact doing they're a community-led group who are doing a consultation around their local high street and potential improvements to their local high street. And quite a number of the people involved in that Philwood Broadway Working Group are older people who we really want this experience to be accessible to also. I mean, in our case, we don't really have any content until the public, and we hope that public will be local people who have lived experience and knowledge of that area, come and engage and actually start to tell their speculative stories about the future of their place and draw together.
Let's talk about the commercials. Sorry, go on, Rob.
It's fair to say, I think we're all prototyping. Like, we're all prototyping towards what it will be like when these technologies are more accessible and more people mediate their world partially digitally to themselves. But one of the interesting things that you end up prototyping then is what it's like to create an experience in a space that only some people can see and that is invisible to other people. You know, whether it's the augmented reality drama shows that I've done, or AR art or art exhibitions and stuff like that. You know, it's been about it being invisible to some people using that space while completely recontextualizing it for other users. So just working in AR is always about experiencing what it's like to have those multiple contexts, the on and the off, existing simultaneously, you know.
So, sorry, go ahead, Nosa.
I think it's also really useful to have a maybe accessibility checklist. And, you know, you're talking about data and how do you know it's there? It's like, well, data, if you're putting in a space, does that space have its own data that people can then latch onto, which is exactly what we did in our project, because it's, you know, intangible spaces that people are already hanging out in. And then also with how do you know it's there? Who's your audience? How do they usually know things are there? Can you latch onto that? You know, it's just thinking about those sorts of things.
Yeah, so the practical aspects of that are really important to actually making it accessible. And I suppose there's two things I want to address here. One is like this question of who owns digital space, but also we've talked a bit previously about commercialism. And I mean, Nosa, I know that you can't talk too much about it, but that there is potential of brands involved. Obviously, you're making a project about streetwear and subcultures. How do we square? I mean, you know, in a way, clusters are wonderful because they fund exciting little gems of R&D projects. But once you need to scale up this business, what do? I'm sure that's a challenge for a lot of these the people in the room and online. How do you start to engage with brand. Is that right, or do we have to be purist about R&D? Is there anything wrong with that?
I don't think there's anything wrong with brands, or yeah, I think the thing with streetwear, which I really love, is that the brands are community-based. They're not like the so-called gatekeepers. They started off at an indie level and then somehow got the clout to become bigger and bigger and bigger. And so I've grown up with brands partnering with things that I like or places that I inhabit, and I guess I'm less cynical about them because I don't think they're the big bad. I think you can tell when brands are the big bad, and when they're the gatekeepers that are trying to keep people out. But I think brands on a community base level are good people to
Yeah, we don't tend to think about brand and community. I think maybe it's a generational shift, actually. I think brand is almost a dirty word for my generation, but you're much younger than me, and I think actually to embrace that kind of the way ideas, it's part of the creativity of subculture associated with brands, isn't it?
And I think also with brands, we have the power because they want to be on our good side to keep the peace and with us then the next generation behind us will be like, okay, we can trust this brand and they'll have more customers, and so the power in this sector I feel lies with us.
Yeah. I want to go to Rob because I know that you've been doing some quite radical work with the My Little Pony brand in the National Gallery, and you've made a fantastic connection for me when we were talking earlier about how that is quite disruptive. I mean, how do you square that with yourself?
I knew this was going to come up. Okay, so last month we launched an app at the National Gallery. It was a PR commission to promote the new My Little Pony movie. It's excellent, if anybody wants to go and see it. I'm really, really proud of this app. It allows you to go around the National Gallery, you view classic paintings which contain horses through the device, and then we magically superimpose onto those paintings My Little Pony versions of those classic paintings. Right?
Brilliant.
Simple idea.
I'm going.
Really, really fun. And one of the things we did is when that magically happens, there's a burst of confetti, and the AR confetti then settles and lies on the floor and makes a little bit of a mess, because to me that was part of the fun. The whole appeal, the reason I'm really proud of this project is the idea of providing for young kids the idea that there is something hidden in the National Gallery, something magical that they can go and discover and that's for them. And that, built into the app is then educational material about the art in the most accessible way, child-friendly way that we could put it. Here's why this painting is interesting, compare it to the My Little Pony painting, all this stuff. The Telegraph, an opinion writer for The Telegraph, hated it.
Oh, good.
Hated the very idea. Now, I haven't read the full article because it's behind the Telegraph's paywall, and why would I? But they hated the very idea of this, and seemingly Caravaggio is rolling in his grave. And the reason seemed to be that the very idea of there being My Little Pony, there being child context, that it somehow mocked the paintings, that it reduced their value, that it would affect other people's experience of the paintings just to know that this additional layer was there. But augmenting only ever means adding. To me, I mean, you can do damage with any kind of word, but to me, it means adding, not taking anything away. I think this idea that there is something fundamentally wrong with adding an additional context, an additional layer, an additional channel through which to experience this same space, which is opt-in and which is invisible to anybody who doesn't want to see it, and which is only, maybe the kids were running around and making a lot of noise and having fun in the gallery. Maybe that's not the point of the gallery. But for me, that was the point. And it seems that the very idea, in some way, of adding in an additional way of looking at the same thing is in itself inherently a political idea to some people. So again, this idea that we're supposed to be retaining and explaining may not actually be the point. The point may be that it's the same explanation that we've heard before, which is largely decided by people in large leather chairs who mostly look like me, let's face it. And that shouldn't be the only person who gets to decide how you use the National Gallery, because it's the National Gallery. So it was an interesting piece, but it was a real exercise in learning how even adding something that doesn't, I would argue, take away from anyone else's experience of that same location can, in the same way that you had your QR codes ripped up, by the very idea,
It's the fear, though, isn't it? People are scared, of something they don't know, and I think that underlies it really, And it's a shame because there's there's a lot of added value.
But there's an exciting potential here for all sorts of kind of cultural experiences, not just a nice to have when you're on a historic palace tour, but for creating a completely alternative narrative, which is around decolonising culture. So if you're on a tour of the British Museum, what's to stop anybody from putting an app like that together and, having a kind of, radical punk attitude to how we use AR in cultural spaces?
Yeah, that's great. Thinking that you could kind of intervene with an unofficial app in the context, in some of these kind of heritage contexts.
Come on, somebody here could make it. Is anyone making it already?
It has already happened to a certain extent. There have been guerrilla curations of MoMA in New York in AR, and I've made this point personally to the National Gallery and other museums that I worked with to say you need to take control of the digital dimension of your space.
Yeah, if you don't do it, someone else will.
Because someone else is going to come along, and that will probably happen anyway. It wasn't meant to sound like a threat, but I've said we could make an app right now that users could walk around and tag their own countercultural or post-colonial or decolonizing narrative to a museum and tag it to that space, and the museum may not even know that is happening, let alone be able to give permission. That's going to start happening more.
I love that. It starts with My Little Pony, but look where it ends up. It's very exciting. I mean, so who owns digital space? How will we regulate? Brian asked another question. How do you govern content? Is it open, or are there standards preventing abuse? Who gets to speak in this digital space?
Thinking about that kind of ownership, I think brings us back a little bit to the generational difference around our kind of response to brands. But I think it also makes me think about who gets to. So I was saying earlier, kind of who gets to tell the stories about the future, but who also gets to kind of co-design the apps. And we're talking about apps as a kind of intervention that might be some kind of, guerrilla apps. I guess, there's questions to ask about whether people get the platforms they want or need, or the platforms they might want to generate content for. So there's questions around at what point do the public and do people get involved in testing those apps or in co-designing those apps. And my sort of rather more kind of dystopian notion of where we might go, which slightly is triggered in a way by thinking about brands, is imagining instead, these kind of, we could think positively and we could think, let's think about digital space making and the potential for these hybrid spaces, the digital layers to open up spaces for multiple voices, for more diverse narratives, for more diverse stories. Or alternatively, we might find that they're like privately owned public spaces layered over privately owned public spaces, with
really interesting.
Big platform developers, capitalizing, turning us into products and capitalizing on our place-based content.
So there's one vision for the future. I'm going to stop you there, Paul, because I noticed time has flown. We've got 30 seconds left. You've got 10 seconds each to tell me the future of AR. Where are we going to be by 2030? He's had a go. Your turn.
I've gone for the dystopian.
Dystopian, okay.
Yeah.
Just a thumbs up or a thumbs down.
I'm going to have to pass it on to you.
I want to pass it to you.
I couldn't say what.
I'll come back to
So I've got 40 seconds, right?
Yeah.
If we don't think about it now and take serious steps to make sure that these systems by which we can inscribe on the digital layer of reality now, if we don't take serious steps to keep that open, the answer to your question will be very simple, because it'll be Google. Google will decide, because in practice the question of who owns digital public space will be less important than the question of who owns the ability to access stuff that people add to that space. The platform is going to be far more important, because if all of your friends are playing in the digital layer in a public square, but they're all accessing it through Google, and you don't want to use Google, you don't get to go. You don't get to go to the party. And it's not to say that Google is necessarily bad, but the means by which access is accessed, for lack of a better word, that's going to become the important thing, and that has to remain open or it will be bought.
I also think, I guess the educational, literacy of how to make work in this space needs to get better. That's, because then it won't be Google, because they won't have, they won't be able to control everything, because there'll be all of these little other places that people will be able to make work on that they don't own.
That's right.
And so that's how I got into this space, was just figuring out, okay, well, I don't really know any institutions that have any money, like what's online and how can I make work? And it was social media. And yes, places, Facebook own social media, but there's still all these like little guerrilla spaces to come up in the world. But it's really, I think,
subcultures will always evolve, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And they will always thrive, because that's the nature of them.
So we're broadly positive, but we've got to watch the dystopian leak. All right, we're going to have to wrap up there. I'm sure you'd all like to put your hands together to thank our panel. It's been really interesting. Thank you very much.